Good afternoon, and thank you for attending today's webinar. My name is Jennifer Cooley, and I am the Education and Outreach Manager for the State Historical Museum. The Iowa History 101 webinars share Iowa stories and the history of the state through a cultural history lens on the second and fourth Thursdays of each month. You can learn more about this series and all of our programs on our website at iowaculture.gov. Please remember to sign up for each webinar you would like to attend. And don't worry if you can't watch live, all presentations will be recorded. Today, we will explore the ways Black communities in the Midwest forged access to residential summer camps, a practice that was evolving into a quintessential experience of American childhood. A few housekeeping points before I introduce our speaker. Everyone came into this webinar on mute with cameras off. Closed captions are available by clicking the closed caption button on your screen. The webinar is being recorded and will be placed on the Iowa Culture page of YouTube in a few days. I have disabled the chat function, but if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A feature throughout the webinar. My colleague Matt Beyer is watching that feature and will prepare a list of questions for the speaker at the end of the presentation. But please note, we may not be able to get to all of the questions. Now I'm pleased to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Sarah Eikleberry. Sarah is the Associate Professor and Assistant Chair in the Department of Kinesiology at Ambrose University, where she teaches courses related to law, culture, history, administration, and pedagogy of sport and physical activity. In the past, her research has explored identity politics in professional and intercollegiate sport settings. Her more recent work investigates the ways in which organizations use sport and recreation to recruit or advance social movements. Sarah originally worked as a community recreation provider and movement educator. A desire to work with a facility who cared about and worked to advance gender equity in sport and recreation led her to the University of Iowa's Health and Sport Studies program. Her academic training and her involvement in the Graduate Employee Union greatly shaped her current teaching, research, and advocacy. Today, Sarah serves on the advisory board for Iowa's Safe Schools, advises the LGBTQ+ student group at St. Ambrose, and works as an organizer to support and protect ballot access for voters in Iowa. And now I'm very happy to turn it over to Sarah to begin the webinar.
Thank you for having me. Is my volume okay, Jennifer?
You sound good.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for attending today, and for those who are watching in the future. I'm really excited to be sharing this work with you today. So as Jennifer mentioned earlier, the name of my talk is Camping While Black, and I'll be focusing on some different versions of segregated summer camps in Iowa from roughly 1925 to 1950. So something I want to start with is this idea that summer vacation, play, and for that matter, childhood have never been a given for all children in this nation. Days spent idle, access to public parks, and even the ability to enjoy a funnel cake or an ice cream cone at the state fair, a state park, or a department store lunch counter are not ubiquitous to all Americans, let alone all Iowans. And today, I'd like to also begin by suggesting that play, folly, and childhood pleasures are actually very serious matters. For African Americans living in Iowa, securing the access to play, parks, and sport participation was quite political. Though the circumstances were not always ideal, Black families and community leaders agitated and organized for access to play experiences that had become quintessential to American childhood. This participation symbolized new possibilities for racial equality, while also reinforcing the social project of organizing around the innocence of Black children. Sadly, this work is still relevant as many people in positions of power continue to overestimate the age of and overpolice Black school-age children in a variety of contexts. As part of my job, I'm always thinking about the ways that sports, movement, and culture interact, either in a contemporary context or a historical one. And for many, sport, outdoor recreation, and exercise are very paradoxical. That is, these are spaces where we experience through our bodies some of our highest highs and our lowest lows. Though my talk will be exploring various types of racial segregation, it's important to remember two things. First, these subjects, both children and adults, were not without agency. They made choices, weighed consequences, and resisted notions of racialized hierarchy in multiple ways. Scholars of Black girlhood insist that children were agents, participants, and change makers who contributed to this nation's long civil rights movement. Second, I'd like you to know that they certainly experienced joy. Their voices, though they may seem dampened by the archive and degraded microfilm, read to me like a graphic novel without captions. Sideways glances, sighing carriages, arms akimbo, their interiors and their thoughts, their dreams, and even their secrets, though they are guarded, they're not lost. They're just waiting for us to find them. Most of my primary source material comes from three special places. The Bystander, a Black-owned weekly newspaper that was one of the oldest presses west of the Mississippi. The owners with the longest tenure, National Bar Association founder James B. Morris, and later his grandson, used the power of the press to dismantle segregation and fight discrimination in Iowa and beyond. The Iowa Oral History Project has also been critical to my calibration of the many events that I've run across while in the archive or reading the Bystander. Workers, professionals, academics, and immigrants' voices help give context, texture, and batting to the sources that I've quilted together. And my last group of sources is the collection of the Des Moines YWCA, which is currently housed in the Iowa Women's Archive at the University of Iowa Libraries. Records, photographs, and scrapbooks from both the Central Association and Black-controlled Blue Triangle branch afford me much perspective on the way that middle-class Black reformers and white reformers understood and reacted to the complicated intersections of race, gender, and class. For today's talk, I'm going to split it into three sections. First, I'm going to overview the early American camping movement and some of the social and historical forces that came to bear on that. Then I'll transition into some of the racialized politics of play and recreation nationally and also within the Midwest and specifically Iowa. And then in the third part of the presentation, I will focus on different types of camps with a major emphasis on Camp Boone at the YW and YMCA camp in Boone, Iowa. The Second Industrial Revolution brought much change to both Europe and North America. By the middle of the 19th century, the American labor force, paid and enslaved, contributed to enormous gains in wealth throughout the country. Immigration from China and Western Europe contributed to numerous industries centered in cities along transit lines. The increasing shift in urbanization contributed to a larger and more stratified middle class than the nation had ever known. This process, termed by Frederick Engels as embourgeoisement, can be thought of as the development of a widely accepted set of middle-class norms that were also adopted by many non-white and working-class Americans. To a degree, a new blueprint for America was being set, and folks were interested in getting into the neighborhood of respectability. With their cultural power and a new ability to set the agenda to solve problems, this varied group created a number of coalitions and organizations that aimed to improve or uplift the lives of numerous groups during the period of the American Reconstruction. Sometimes known as progressives or reformers, these folks centered their efforts on developing new strategies to police behavior, enhance public health, and ameliorate the scourge of urban life. Alongside campaigns to end mostly white child labor, obtain suffrage for white women, and increase access to education for white children, Black men and women began many of their own parallel projects through historically Black colleges, existing churches, and other social organizations. The earliest reform organizations that contributed to camp experiences for children traced their roots back to Europe during the same period. Whether working with urban youth, be they white, Black, or recent immigrants, reformers initially viewed their work as formative rather than reformative. Boy Scouts of America maintained that in slums, they were indeed skimming the cream. Even middle-class Black club women in Chicago were more interested in arousing other women's sense of civic duty, not necessarily creating an even playing field among their own middle-class daughters and the masses of the working poor. Urban reformers, often working with single-sex populations, tended to frame their ideas along complicated lines of gender. Reformers working with both boys and girls tried to curb behavior that they believed to be deleterious, namely the following: masturbation, sexual activity outside of marriage, drinking alcohol, And for girls, speaking up against family abuse or refusing marriage arrangements. Cities were both an impediment to girls, but also a solution to improving their lives, particularly to Black girls migrating north. Settlement houses, YWCAs, and later campfire and Girl Scout troops worked with girls to live up to the ideals of racial uplift, namely self-presentation and educational success. Elite vacationers had already invested into the curative power of outdoor spas and vacation resorts as a kind of a part of conspicuous leisure consumption. Doing the seasons for ultra-wealthy leisure classes involved the migration from health-oriented resorts located in settings whose curative properties, like natural springs, were accompanied by posh amenities. Scenic views, fresh air, and isolated environs were further romanticized as cities filled with more people and polluting industries. Before discovering pharmacological treatments for tuberculosis, sanatoriums or other open-air hospitals were constructed in less polluted and remote locations. Contemporary to the play movement, a progressive construction of athleticism waged a hostile battle against lower-class amusements while rejecting the bourgeois idleness of the leisure class. Open-air rowing and football competitions gained traction at elite American colleges, and French aristocrat Baron de Coubertin resurrected the modern Olympic movement. Middle-class reformers greatly worried about the softening or feminizing impact of a less strenuous life that left their sons in the care of women while fathers toiled at desks in urban centers. Meanwhile, trolley car companies looking to create additional reasons to patronize their tracks helped to create and popularize the notion of city parks. Targeting women and childcare workers, these industries promoted the restorative and moralizing impact of fresh air and grassy knolls, conveniently located at the end of the trolley lines. By the 1890s, golf courses increased access to public green spaces, and the constructions of public swimming pools also emerged. It almost goes without saying that these spaces were very discriminatory. Elite sports clubs rarely invited women beyond the clubhouses. Full memberships were typically reserved for white Protestants whose families had multi-generational wealth. Open water swimming areas often limited any public changing areas so as to further segregate the wealthy from those who did not have the means to erect privacy tents or travel in carriages. In cities, natatoriums were erected, many of which were indoors. Working class men, both white and in some instances Black, were welcome to swim together in unchlorinated waters. Chlorine came later, as did outdoor pools. Historian Jeff Wiltz notes that as municipalities moved to allow women and men to swim together, cities came with the quickness, opting to racially segregate natatoriums, often leaving communities of color with no place to cool off. And I'll just direct you to the slides I have, or the images on the left. These are two images of, one is on the bottom left, an illustration from a postcard of Vanderveer Park, kind of near my house and my center of employment, which would have been, a mile from the downtown center at the time. So using that as an illustration of having to go outside of the business district to get away, and oftentimes taking those trolley lines downtown in Davenport. And the top left, you'll see the image of our former natatorium, which was very much so racially segregated, meaning that for a long time, African Americans were not allowed to swim there. And that building is no longer standing. Early camps were founded by enthusiastic individuals rather than dedicated organizations. YMCA camps began as very small 1- or 3-day excursions involving swimming, camping, hiking, and really big meals. They drew their elements from holiday outings, camp meetings, hiking, military encampments, boarding school, and resort life. Short-term camps for churches in Chautauqua were very bare bones, sometimes involving tents and a flat field. Not much privacy was afforded. For most early campers, usually age 12 and older, small campfires always provided time for conversation, rousing singing, and ideally, for the organizers, evangelical conclusions. Eventually, vespers were replaced with stories and stunts at the campfire or the lodge. Prayers were left over for leaders to conduct in the cabins. These are some images from the from the Des Moines YWCA, and these are, I believe, from around 1923. And the women who you'll see in the center and in the left hand are women from the YWCA Association, as well as the Industrial Girls Club, many of whom they used their labor to construct and dig out trenches and prepare for the construction of what would later be their camp at Boone. Though a small number of African Americans have lived in Iowa since it was a territory, the population has only recently exceeded 4%. Unlike neighboring states to the south, a large enslaved population was not present, though bonds and codes limited their early establishment as residents. By the turn of the 20th century, Black Southerners followed handsome economic opportunities in coal and rail communities, and domestics traveled with families vacationing in Okoboji. College-educated graduates and faculty were recruited to colored officers training camp at Fort Des Moines during World War I, and other Black women enlisted as WACs during World War II. And during both wars, non-commissioned officers and nurses traveled to Camp Dodge. Industrial leaders continued to attract Black workers, particularly in communities such as Davenport, Cedar Rapids, and Waterloo. I'd like to introduce two ways that I'll talk about two ways that discrimination occurred in recreation. The one that we're probably more familiar with in terms of terminology is segregation, or the total separation of racial groups, often with a hierarchical implication. Sometimes this type of discrimination was very overt and structural, and other times these patterns were more understood. Des Moines lawyer and newspaper editor James Morris recalled that they always had little ways of letting you know. Pharmacist James Mitchell said, the occasional oversalted meal at Rock Island Station or a crispy thin piece of steak sent the message loud and clear to him. Others reported being handed a dirty towel at Birdland Swimming Pool in Des Moines, while one boy experienced the delay of care by white dentists until it was determined that a Black one was utterly unreachable. In Des Moines, Good Park was the understood space where Black families could swim, play tennis, and picnic together. The second form of discrimination I'm going to refer to as biracialism, and I'll direct you to this slide. This was a frequent mode of exclusion in Des Moines, like many communities in Iowa and the Midwest more broadly. In short, like my slide illustrates, you'll notice that one class or session is reserved for the group with less power. Usually the session comes at the end of a day or a season, but it includes the same facility. So this was a pretty common practice in the Des Moines Park and Recreation Department for swim lessons, or as my slide illustrates on the right, dance classes at the Central YWCA, particularly before a Black managed Blue Triangle branch was erected. Marguerite Esters Cawthorn, playground supervisor, social worker, and activist in Des Moines, also recalls that Roosevelt High School took pains to remove and place Black students in alternative courses during swimming classes. Black students were discouraged from swimming by any means necessary, often being routed to take study hall or orchestra during their aquatics units. Cawthorn maintained that that spirit carried over to the playground and to swimming classes at the high school pools where Black children always had the last class of the day, further reinforcing white assumptions about Black ability and hygiene. The former social worker also recalls at East High, a light-skinned friend attending a football social with her darker Black boyfriend. Both her and her boyfriend danced with other white students that evening. The misstep, according to Cawthorn, resulted in the elimination of those socials for the rest of the year. Similarly, Drake University did not allow for Black students full participation in their teacher education program until the 1930s. African-American students simply had their practicums waived. It should be no surprise that Black professionals were not employed in the Des Moines public schools or health departments until the mid-1940s. By 1920, despite a housing shortage, over 5,800 African Americans resided in Polk County. Due to discriminatory housing policies, several Black neighborhoods and eventually a bustling business district provided much entertainment. In schools, some boys had access to track and field, but more often participated in church or community center basketball, softball, and boxing leagues. For girls, most opportunities were tied to physical education courses and community center majorettes, Girl Reserves, Girl Scouts, or bicycle clubs. Like many cities, the Black-controlled branches of the YM and YWCA community centers, and select recreational facilities in Black neighborhoods provided Des Moines junior high and high school students with additional opportunities to dance, roller skate, bowl, hike, and play lawn sports. In order to satisfy segregationists in the South, most Black YM and YWCAs had to accept branch status, existing separately, but under the supervision of the mostly white central boards. Similar structures existed for Boy Scouts and Campfire Girls. By the 1940s, there were a number of racially integrated dance socials hosted by these Black community groups, but USO clubs, a space where many teen girls served as junior hostesses, remained segregated. Black families typically recreated on parks on the east side and held events at shelters at Good, Union, and Prospect Park. Throughout the nation, middle-class Black leaders politicized play and recreation by positioning that children, and particularly girls, were worthy citizens. They also used their clout to petition others for resources to deliver a protected Black childhood. Part advocacy, part defense of the child, the social project relied heavily on the notion of good and bad race representatives. There were many glass ceilings when it came to play and recreation in Iowa. In 1928, the Black press celebrated when Marguerite Esters, at the time, the daughter of the local funeral home director and hotel owner, was hired as a playground supervisor for Logan School, Garfield, and McKinley. Cothern, the first Black graduate of Roosevelt High School, was an athletic standout as a teen. As a junior at Drake University, she excelled in many sports and was a member of the Women's Athletic Association, the organization responsible for providing most recreation and sport for college women. In Des Moines, civically minded donors helped to ensure that Black children could attend summer camps during the Depression. Camper subscription drives and button campaign funds were two common ways for boys and girls to secure scholarship for a week in the great outdoors. Editors at the Bystander believed that the experience at camp was crucial to deterring youngsters from delinquent hijinks. Though most residential camps operated under the specter of segregation, most years, between 200 and 300 children from Iowa, Illinois, Missouri, Nebraska, and Texas traveled to Boone, Iowa for the Crocker Street or Blue Triangle camp periods. White commitment to segregation was reaffirmed in 1934 by the YMCA. After 11 seasons of sharing the pool, the all-white YMCA board denied Black girls swimming privileges in their Boone, Iowa camp pool. That year, a scheduling revision resulted in an overlap between the white boys and Black girls sessions. This reduced the girls' only access to water play in the recently flooded Des Moines River. One local Black physician warned that the river was heavily infested with disease germs and poisonous matter. Bystander editors argued that with all the frills stripped off, the YMCA was guilty of the unchristian policy of segregation and mean-spirited exclusion. The YM board pulled out all the defensive stops. Something might happen, a thinly veiled reference to interracial sexual encounters. We might lose members. Donors aren't ready for this. You just can't rush interracial work. Bystander editors dismissed the sexual scare tactics, pointed out that the Depression was difficult for all organizations and that patrons prone to reducing gifts were probably doing so because of personal hardship, not because the YMCA was trying to be fair to Black girls. The next summer, the swimming schedule was resolved, though segregation remained rule, but an opportunity had been created in 1934. The YMCA's insistence in doubling down on their rigid race policies prompted a dogged defense of Black girls from white women, as well as the rest of the Black community, particularly as it came to their access of these experiences always enjoyed by white campers. Additionally, by centering the interests of Black girl campers, both white and Black leaders were able to foreground the dignity and worth of Black girlhood. Before turning to Camp Boone, I want to take a little time to highlight some of the experiences and camps where Black and white campers rubbed elbows. Many of these camps can be tied to early scouting organizations. Early Boy Scout camps were very masculinist, militarized, and frankly, a failure in a lot of ways, resulting in many sore backs and a lot of constipation. Early Scoutmasters learned that young boys are indeed not tiny adults. Though many had to pull back on the physicality and the strenuosity of the experience, camps still reflected androcentric capitalist ideals and were often taken up and run by proponents of vigorous athletics. In more well-established camps in New York, the last session of the season for campers, or last sessions of the season were reserved for campers with less social power, specifically children with disabilities or lower income campers. Occasionally, these groups would be racially integrated in their programming, but were often housed off-site. In 1920, Camp Westchester in Westchester, New York, invited the neediest boys, and who were often regarded as the toughest, to participate in a racially integrated camp. Counselors reported that the youngsters were as well behaved as the more fortunate boys who came from the better homes. They were also more appreciative. In 1930, Black campers were invited to Camp Occoneecon in New Jersey, where they shared counselors and day programming, but were given separate quarters and swimming hours. Though arrangements with the Trenton Negro YMCA were made without incident, the Board of Trustees did not invite that group back the following summer. Boy Scout troops for Black youth began sprouting up in central Iowa by 1921. Camp Metigwa opened as a Boy Scout camp 7 miles north of Woodward on 123 acres in 1923. Early Scout camps often included daily calisthenics, morning open water dips, and specific hours set aside for Vespers, Bible study, or other spiritual training. Military titles, buglers, flag raising, mess halls, and chores such as KP duty were present at most. Several all-Black troops joined their white peers in the 1940s at Metigwa, though the details are somewhat limited. It's unlikely that Black campers shared cabins or tents with other Scouts, but perhaps that evidence is out there. At Camp Hantessa, adjacent to Ledges State Park, campfire girls descended upon the site to participate in Luther and Charlotte Gulick's brainchild, the Campfire Girls system. Their feminine rationalized approach was designed to stimulate the imagination, guide it into channels of beauty, inspire ideals through simple ritual, while encouraging healthful activities and appreciations for the feminine role. Though never officially excluded, national leaders ignored or minimized Black campfire chapters' contributions to the movement. These chapters, like many other Black members of semi-segregated organizations, reinterpreted the organization's mission to fit the concerns and conditions met by Black girls. According to Martha Chatelain, these leaders negotiated the politicized dimensions of recreation and leisure spaces to galvanize community resources. Specifically, they capitalized on collective and community fears related to delinquency and sexuality. Another offshoot of campfire that took off in the Midwest were the Minute Girls. Devised by Gulick during World War I, this accelerated program promoted preparation for the service during wartime. Minute Girls were to privilege toughness over a nurturing demeanor prone to nerves and softness. Gulick believed that during War and Peace, women's greatest power was in service to the needs of her community, namely the protection of the home, the care of children, and care for the sick. Minute Girls were mandated 13 requirements, some of which included wearing uniforms, performing 5 minutes of calisthenics a day, learning first aid, donating $1 to a relief society, and walking 40 miles over the course of 4 days. Camp Moingona near Grimes was another option for girls involved with the Girl Scout movement to take respite from urban life. Des Moines troops based out of community centers and churches had the options to attend. In 1944, 2 Black troops attended Moingona with other white troops. After World War I, most of these camps started to transition from tents to cabins. And I can't say for sure that these housing quarters were segregated, but one thing that is known is that in 1944, the Junior Chamber of Commerce of Des Moines did earmark $1,500 specifically for sending Black Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts to these separate camps, as well as erecting a cabin. And so the details are still a little bit fuzzy on if that cabin would have been exclusively reserved for those troops or if there was more mixing. The last camp I want to speak to you about is a little bit out of our central Iowa region. That's Camp Okoboji. Camp Okoboji functioned as a larger site for YWCAs to hold conferences and all-state camps. YW women could host adult retreats for their business girls, camping weekends, or host their own regional professional meetings. In 1921, Des Moines native Mary Wood attended the Conference for Colored YWCA Girls. Wood flourished within the YW and became the first African-American executive director to lead a large metro. 6 years later, Clara Webb attended a mixed-race girl reserve conference at Okoboji with girls of all races, including Indigenous girls from both the Midwest and parts of the South. 10 years later, in 1937, Webb, a social worker in Des Moines, was named the first Black board member to the Central Committee of the Des Moines YWCA. Iowa girls did not report encountering racial animus at Okoboji or other mixed-race camps, despite their token status. Still, this was not always the case at mixed-race Midwestern camps. Campfire girls from Chicago recalled that counselors put different pressure on them to resolve their race-based disputes. And in 1945, at a Chicago Commons camp, white counselors fielded complaints from Black girls about mean-spirited white campers. Ultimately, those white adults placed the onus on the Black girls to change the outlook of their adversarial peers. So now we'll switch over to kind of focusing just on these two Y camps that were located at Boone, Iowa, and that still operate under the purview of the YMCA. There are few opportunities for most Black communities to erect and manage their own camps in Iowa. In Des Moines, the YM and YWCA both owned adjacent camps in Boone, Iowa. Most often, Blue Triangle or Crocker Street Y Camp was reserved for the last session in August. So kind of taking that biracial frame or that biracialism framework. Their camps were run on skeleton crews during what was often cited, or at least recalled, as the rainiest and coldest session of the summer. In short, Black children came last. Whatever vermin had taken root in the camps was managed by strict mail policies. Mail as in postal mail. Parents' care packages had to be opened in front of counselors, and no food was allowed to be sent. Parents were reassured that their children would be given enough to eat. And furthermore, branches advertised that Black cooks would be present. After 1930, the alignment of the boys and girls sessions eliminated tensions over the shared use of the in-ground swimming pool, other than in 1934. During the camping periods for Black youth, regional staff made an effort to bring in more Black personnel. At YW camps, white college-age women were hired for the entire season, along with more Black personnel to fill in during the Blue Triangle periods. Some of these counselors, such as Austrian immigrant Busti Blason, did remain during the Blue Triangle periods, but the housing incentives did not shield the organization from the effects of staff who had less experience or were more poorly trained to be at the camps. The male-led YM side of things was a little bit different because a lot of their personnel, who were oftentimes volunteers from the community or scout leaders, did have a background in Boy Scouts, military training, or other types of involvement that gave them more exposure to camping. By all accounts, the programming at Boone doesn't really seem that much different than a lot of summer camps you'd visit today. There are no records of drowning or incidents of note other than some Crocker Street boys being sent home early in 1943 for bad behavior and a girls' camp being cut short due to excessive rain. Gas shortages during the Depression changed towing and tubing activities on the river, and ration booklets were required to attend camps during World War II. Boys certainly had more militaristic and fitness awards, and occasionally they had Hawkeye football stars like Ozzie Simmons visit the camp. Occasionally girls would swap metalworking for macrame, but boys and girls enjoyed indoor and outdoor fires, open air slumber parties, swimming at the outdoor pool, taking pictures, participating in dramatics, clay modeling, daytime and nighttime hikes, occasional rides in the truck, playing ukulele, eating pretzels, watermelon, and wading and towing one another along the shores of the river. Similar timing, experiences, and supervision did not produce the same numbers of girls as it did for boys. Even in the face of the Depression, the Black boys session at Boone always swelled. The girls' camp did accommodate less campers, and prices were typically $3 to $4 higher than ones for boys, even when the sessions were the same length. Now, part of that is probably because the YM camp accommodated twice as many campers, which of course allowed them to fix and set their prices differently than the YW. I think it's also important to note that for many Black girls, and certainly for their mothers or their parents who had migrated from the South, Having the summer free for leisure was not really always a given. Despite the similarities of experience, camp was markedly different for sons versus daughters. For boys, it was all about staying out, and this is the marketing. For boys, it was all about staying out of trouble, particularly during the Depression. Marcia Chatelain argues that as the Depression hit, most Black families, as the Depression hit Black families harder and in a more prolonged way. Black middle-class press editors and writers and columnists expressed more anxiety about delinquency, particularly as their own proximity to poverty tightened. This was also due, of course, to the segregation of housing in northern cities and the increase in policies that were leading to sundown counties and communities. Poor children were much more likely to be labeled delinquent. And this wasn't always a result of criminal acts of opportunity, but moreover, an over-policing of poverty, particularly in schools. At school, children were cited for stealing apples from a cookroom, improper dress, or unkempt appearances. Clothing choice, proximity to pop culture, particularly fashion and makeup, was also a frequent target. Black leaders often elevated social workers and college-educated YMCA secretaries like Gordon Kitchen to sainthood for the guidance that they provided to the men and women of tomorrow, in their own words. Irrespective of race, charm schools, weight-reducing classes, and other etiquette workshops were popular winter programs for teens, domestics, and industrial girls. Though community beliefs related to idol, parental involvement, and community outreach were not unison, most ascribed the idea that there was a lack of respect between younger boys and their elders. One YMCA secretary argued that chores required at camp would increase the appreciation boys had for their mothers, sisters, and future wives. For girls, the marketing strategy was more protective. A discursive turn towards the protection of girls and the assurance of safety and wholesomeness persisted throughout the decades with the Boone YW camp. Advertisements claimed that the Boon Camp was an ideal place for Iowa girls to spend their free vacations, offering all the activities that delight the hearts of girls, carefully supervised and located in a beautiful spot in the Des Moines River Valley. Girls' exposure to rougher or more physical play at camp was frequently balanced with pageantry and the exaltation of their future status as girlfriends and wives by the staff and senior cabin leaders in their newsletters. Though filled with gossip about liking boys or being rotund, these newsletters also held space for girls to write about their career ambitions. And I've provided just a snippet of one of these newsletters on the right. What's not clear to me is whether these newsletters were distributed just at the camps or if their parents also received them. So it's a little bit of a hanging question for me. But in camp newsletters, different girls were reported to have different hobbies, such as Rosemarie Oglesby of Fraser was reported to enjoy dancing. And two of the things that she liked best were clothes and certain boys. And Dorothy Jackson of Texas loved beautiful things, especially the beauty in nature. One college student at Wiley College in Marshall, Texas, Dorothy Jackson, aimed to become a librarian. And according to Nat Camp News, unlike Rosemarie, Dorothy did expect to be married sometimes. So even though this kind of sounds like fluff, I think it's important to remember that these documents, whether they were created by camp leaders or even some of the older girls who are in charge of the cabins, does allow for like a cool expression of their interiority, and also demonstrates that the girls, specifically the girls in this case, had lots of different interests, and maybe we're not all thinking that their lives are going to look just the same as their mothers later on. And this stands in stark opposition to the document or the image that I have on the left, the Floyd's Flowers book. This was a much more stringent etiquette and like kind of like code book for, very much a strict blueprint of middle-class Black respectability. So gossip about boys, of course, was further elevated in the camp scandals section of the YW newsletter. And despite the silly camp chatter, readers could be assured that girls like Mary Jane may have enjoyed swimming and music, but that the Waterloo native's ambition was to become a musician or a businesswoman. Camp leaders admitted to recruiting certain types of girls for the camp, so we're not straying so much from those middle-class sensibilities. But grooming the next generation through the YM and the YW, it didn't escape those middle-class sensibilities. And I think that that's very reflective in the source material and of course the general projects of the YM and the YWCA nationwide. In 1946, the YWCA of America declared that they would more deeply commit to a bond of common sisterhood by integrating all their buildings and programming. In Des Moines, this resulted in the sale of the branch and the integration of the 1947 camp season. The Blue Triangle branch of the YW created a committee and determined a series of best practices for moving forward. Many of their concerns surrounded the ability of integrating both campers, leaders, and staff, and of course, warding off complaints and disrespect from both white campers and parents. Many girls' families still elected to send their girls to the traditional end of season slot, creating some consternation among middle-class mothers. Simply put, for most people, the trust was not there. The Crocker Street YMCA sessions continued into the 1950s, though by 1948, changes in the YMCA of America's policies were starting to trickle into camps out east, like Camp Spear in the Pocono Mountains region near Scranton, Pennsylvania. In some regions, branches garnered enough resources to purchase their own camps. In Missouri, the Phyllis Wheatley branch of the YMCA purchased a camp from the CCC and renamed it Camp Daraco. Camp Daraco was named after Juliet Daraco, a very, very prominent women's dean at Fisk University, who had unfortunately been in a tragic car accident and died because she was not able to exact care from a racially segregated hospital. So even the naming of that camp was very political in nature. Similarly, the St. Louis YMCA Pine Street branch managed Camp Rivercliff, a gem tucked into the Ozarks that exclusively served Black youth. In all of these iterations, circumstances were not ideal, but the experiences were valued by both adults and children. In the face of discriminatory policies, prejudice from white campers, and hostile tactics of intimidation, Black leaders forged programs that centered children who had been left on the stoops in many other recreational arenas. Though perhaps not as essential as education attainment or access to safe housing, access to recreation and camping was more than fun and games. By engaging in a quintessential part of American childhood, the presence of Black girls and boys represented the possibility of equality and equity. As facilities integrated, the proximity, comfort, and oftentimes programming designed by and for Black youngsters faded. In Des Moines, the Crocker Street served mostly Black and some white men until 1959, before being raised to make room for a new freeway. The YWCA embraced interracial leadership, space, and programming by 1947 and held on to their Black literary clubs, race relations mixers, and interracial dinner clubs into the 1950s. To date, much of the scholarship that explores the sport or recreation experiences of Black Iowans has centered on contributions of young elite athletes. Embraced as pioneers, men like Ozzie Simmons, Jack Trice, and Johnny Bright, each college athletes who sustained serious on-field injuries while playing on predominantly white teams. Jamie Schultz argues that the legacies of these talented men have manifested in distinct commemorative actions: Floyd of Rosedale, the naming of Jack Trice Stadium, and the naming of Johnny Bright Field. The actions, however, do not significantly repair or improve circumstances for members of the African diaspora. In fact, Schultz argues, this form of racialized memory functions as a redress to an unpleasant version of our history. Furthermore, these forms of memory allow for an uncritical embrace of a sport and leisurescape that refuses race and other forms of sinister inequity. The absence of Black participants, workers, and leaders in many sport and recreation fields neither indicates a lack of interest nor ability. Professional franchise front offices, college coaching staffs, local park boards, and still too often outdoor and wilderness spaces do not reflect the demographics of their surrounding locales and the regions they purport to serve. A few months ago, while I was sitting outside a neighborhood cafe in Davenport, I bumped into an old acquaintance from a fitness center I used to go to. And I said hi, and I told him a little bit about the project I was working on, which is this presentation today. And this young man was an Iowa native. He is Black, and he was 21 years old. And so he started to talk to me about some of his recent experiences he had attending a residential camp. And he went on to mention that he had been selected for a very special type of spirit award when he was 16, so about 5 years ago. When he received this award, a camp counselor told him that he was a pioneer, and he was confused by that. And when he inquired as to why or how, the employee informed him that in the camp's nearly 90 years of operation, he was the first Black camper to receive that award. So since the summer of 2020, over 10 million American households participated in their first camping trips. Vamping, glamping, and other hybridized forms of outdoor enjoyment are bringing more people back into the great outdoors. Black camping collectives like Outdoor Afro, Melanated Campout, and Black and Camping provide advice, networking, excursions, recipes, and even direct vacationers to Black-owned campsites or points of interest where they can expect to be welcome. And so in the context of some of the work I've shared with you today, I'm really glad to see folks using the World Wide Web to connect with one another and support one another and direct each other to spaces that they know will be more inclusive and give Black identifying campers more positive experiences. Inequitable resources and hostile attitudes compound barriers of access and representation within recreation and leisurescapes. Vestiges of redlining permeate the bones of disinvested infrastructure in all of our cities. Recreation still serves as an important lens to view the politics of race relations 90 years after these specific maps were created by realtors, banks, and federal lending programs. These gaps have impacted walkability, bike paths, and numerous public safety outcomes that further segregate and separate neighborhoods and neighbors. But I'm not one to end on such a low note. Of course, I'll just direct your attention to this image on the screen. This is from the Polk County Housing Authority, and these are indeed the maps that were used to indicate areas of different levels of economic risk. So if you've heard of the term redlining, these kind of pinkish red neighborhoods were considered the areas of highest economic risk and were often the they were the only places where African Americans were able to find housing, which was oftentimes inadequate and not invested in. The green areas were considered the least risky and were oftentimes buttressed or kind of like enclosed by these blue and yellow transition neighborhoods. And so lay this over. In 2021, the city of Des Moines was awarded federal grant money to extend existing cycling and walking paths south of Euclid Avenue. And so as you'll note, some of these stars were in some of the most highly redlined areas in Des Moines in the 30s. These types of investments and this social infrastructure is but one of many paths forward to the journey to repair the trust and facilitate the recovery from Jim Crowism and racist policies that still come to bear on where and how we come to play today. Thanks for coming to this presentation. And at this time, I would be so happy to entertain any questions that you would have. And I think Matt's going to kind of organize those. So if you've dropped any in the questions and answer box or you have more, I think that's where you're supposed to put them. And I see that there are a few.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Sarah. We have some time to answer some questions. And like you said, if you have questions, please submit them through our Q&A feature right there on Zoom. But please note, we may not be able to get to all questions before the end of our program today. But let's get started. Ricky King asks, who's a past presenter actually for our 101 series, asks, did you find any information of where parents sent their children to Black church camps out of state? Her mom was sent to Indiana.
Oh, no, I didn't find that. And I know that that was absolutely another mechanism or another social organization that did invest in those type of summer experiences. Sometimes in the bystander, they would note that like a child or, somebody who lived in the community, usually in Des Moines, had been sent somewhere else in the summer, but I didn't see that. And what I probably should do is go back, because at different points in time, the bystander has these sections called church notes. And I think I've got it in my notes somewhere where they kind of start and come. And I bet that would be a good place to go back and check to see if there was any mention of those. I'd love to hear more about those experiences.
Perfect. Next question. Do you know the origins of the blue triangle name for the camp in Boone?
Yeah, oh gosh, so this is something I think, I know I have it in my notes somewhere. So the blue triangle, I believe, was picked as some sort of symbol. I think it was a little bit before World War I. I can't quite remember what the significance was to the YWCA, but the blue triangle did come in to later stand in for the Black branches. And so I think it was just adopted. So if you were to like come upon old YWCA artifacts, even buildings or things of that nature, that blue triangle, I think after World War II, almost always came to stand in for an African-American managed or managed branch, entity. Yes, I'm sorry, I can't quite remember the actual meaning or ideology of that blue triangle.
Still very interesting. So can you talk about the importance of play in childhood, particularly in the era you studied? How did it impact lives, particularly of Black Iowa children?
Yeah, so what I found is that depending on the community that you lived in, of course, race relations might impact the actual type of neighborhood you grew up in, and sometimes even the type of school you're allowed to go to, though there wasn't necessarily these harsh forms of racial segregation in our public schools. But one thing I would say is that oftentimes if I were to come back to a city like Des Moines, it was not necessarily a given that a Black identifying child was going to have access to something that was a new and popular trend. So when I think about something like roller skating, oftentimes what we see are churches, YWs, and community centers often kind of creating makeshift spaces so that because these adults felt like these recreational experiences were worthy and fun. And so there was access to certain types of play experiences, but they were always, they were oftentimes like not in these mainstream areas. And I know there was a little bit more to your question than that. That was just the first example that jumped in there.
Yeah, and you did a good job answering it too. The second part was how to impact lives, particularly Black Iowa children.
Yeah, and I think that it's a complicated answer. And I think that one thing my presentation didn't tap into as much today is that so much of it also had to do with the resources that your own family had. And so a lot of the evidence that I look through, or even the kids that end up at a lot of these camps, are probably coming from families that have just a little bit more means than others. And so whether they identified as members of the middle class, they at least had access to certain types of resources, or they had caught the eye of somebody that had access to those resources. So I think for some children, they really didn't have as rich and full of play experiences, but with the especially in Polk County, I think by 1930 there were 20 or 25 different Black churches. I think that there were adults who were trying to create these spaces and have these fun activities for them. Now, your ability to actually get out there and enjoy them and not be kind of stuck at home, maybe like watching younger brothers and sisters, really depended on a lot of different factors.
That's actually perfect because it ties into our next question a little bit. Outside of fees, how were the YM and YWCA camps for Black Iowans funded before the integration of the camps?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, so the fees were probably the individual parent fees. One thing that I saw were a lot of creative different types of fundraisers that oftentimes were housed at those YM and YW sites, but sometimes the Black churches, I think St. Paul's used to have different types of activities like cakewalks or workshops where girls and boys might create some sort of handicraft, or maybe like men and women from the community would come and they would bring something that could be sold. And then those funds would oftentimes go to the agencies. And then also there's these examples of kids peddling the bystander subscriptions on the streets. So certain businesses, kind of put the kids to work and would also give them a little bit of money to go to camp. And we started to see that, I think, with the Boy Scout and Girl Scouts later. And then occasionally white donors would also give to that. I think that there are some examples of the Jewish Community Center allowing some of their spaces in town and maybe some of their resources to help go to different types of communities, including camp.
our next question. Is there a place to find a list of which church denominations ran segregated camps in Iowa?
Oh, I don't have that list. And if anybody has a list, I'd love to know. Which, like the specific denominations, I don't have access to that information. Maybe our first question, or the person who mentioned the first question with their parent going to one in Indiana might have a better insight.
And this is actually going to be our last question today. I like to end because I think research is sometimes really fun. And I always find really great stuff while doing research. So I'd like to ask, what was your favorite research source you found and why?
Oh, yeah. I would say that, so I've been collecting these sources for over 8 years. It's kind of a slow process, especially working with a source like the bystander, which is not digitized during this period that I'm looking for. But probably my favorite source that I love to look at, and I come to Des Moines every couple of months to try to collect more of it. I think I might be done with this data set, was a columnist who had a weekly column in the Bystander. Her name was Marie Ross. She was a trained journalist out of Kansas University, and she ended up becoming the news editor for the Bystander, I think by the late 30s and early 40s. So she herself was very much a member of the Black middle class. She was a tennis instructor. She was sporty. She was out in the community, very much a mover and a shaker, very influential. But she also wrote this, I'd call it a gossip or a social column. And so a lot of the things that I find about the community that are, just about regular people living their lives are through this column, which I don't like to use the word fluff, but I think that's oftentimes how women's writings were treated, even though she did receive awards for her writing and her news editing later in her life. And one of the things that I found out from Marie Ross was that I believe it was in 1942, where the state basketball tournament for girls was going on, the 6-on-6 basketball craze that Iowa very much supported from the 1920s, that there was a Black girl, I believe, from Centerville, Iowa, on one of those teams. And I thought that was really exciting. And then as I read the article, Marie Ross was commenting on how she actually had to stay in, she wasn't allowed to stay in a hotel with the rest of her white teammates. And even though that of course, was a story that made me sad. And I was also surprised that I was surprised. I thought, I was so grateful to have this woman who was taking the business of girls and women and social life seriously enough to document it and leave it in this beautiful source that sits in the Central Library of Des Moines.
Well, that's a fantastic source. That's great. Well, with that answer, we'll bring this webinar to a close, but I think we all can agree this has been a very informative lunch, and thank you very much, Sarah. I appreciate your talking today.
Thank you.
And thank you to everyone joining us as well. We hope everyone will sign up for the Iowa History 101 webinars that take place on the 2nd and 4th Thursdays throughout the year. There are many great stories from Iowa's past to tell in the upcoming months. Now, for more information and to register for future webinars in this series, please check out our website at iowaculture.gov. This webinar and past presentations are available on our website as well. And while you're there, you can check out some of our other fantastic digital programs, such as our Goldie's Kids Club activity for young historians, or watch video recordings of the Iowa Stories series, which is hosted by our Iowa City branch. We look forward to virtually seeing you here again on Thursday, January 27th for our next Iowa History 101 webinar. Thank you all again for joining us today, and have a great afternoon. Thanks, everyone.